A very good evening, and let me welcome you to the 60th event. Yes, this is the Shashtabdurti of us talks at the Chennai International Center. Great to see, and completely, had no doubt that there would be a wonderful crowd today, as there is. It's our pleasure to have a launch of this book by Dr. Nandita Krishna, the Life Lessons series. I have read the book. I promise you, I went through it, and thank you for giving it to me. It was a lovely reading, and who better than to be here with us other than the Honorable Member of Parliament from Trivandrum, Mr. Shashi Tharoor, whose speeches constantly make us feel completely inadequate in terms of our power of expression. I've had the privilege of watching him many years ago when he came to speak along with Dr. C.K. Prahalad at the then Trident on whether Gandhiji would resort to violence or not, under what circumstances. And that was a wonderful talk. I still remember that today. Welcome, Mr. Shashi Tharoor. And of course, we have Justice Prabhadevi, should I say former Justice Prabhadevi. This is why pardon me if I'm making any error in my expression, to also be here to receive the book and share a few words. So without further ado, let us start the book launch.
I'm sure we are all eager to know more about the series, its content and context. So on that note, let me invite Dr. Nandita Krishna to address the audience.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start by thanking the Chennai International Center, Mr. Gopal Srinivasan and Vanitha Shankar for organizing this launch here today. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you and to see the books being launched, the whole series. I'd like to thank Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who has come down all the way from Delhi to launch these books and the series in Chennai. Shashi and I are childhood friends. We both were little kids playing together in Bombay in Kasturi building, where we grew up. And then, of course, we've stayed very close friends since then. And as Shashi in one of his books describes me, my sister from another womb. I thought that was a beautiful description, which only Shashi could get. I'd like to thank Mr. Gopal Srinivasan particularly for organizing this, and Justice Prabhadevi. When we thought of your name, I was very keen and also very worried because she's a great Sanskrit scholar herself. Luckily, I'm going to be speaking in English and all my translations are in English. And I have already said that this is shortening everything, the long translations, into little aphorisms. So my Sanskrit won't be on show today. So thank you very much. And Vanitha Shankar, who has organized the whole program. Thank you, Vanitha. She has worked very, very hard. The Life Lessons series is a series of books which are coming out. I have written the first two on Adi Shankara and Mahavira. Rather, I would say I have edited the first two. We had a lot of discussion whether we should say by or edited. But I said, although we have written the introduction, each one of us, whoever is writing the book, finally we are only editing what people like Adi Shankara and Mahavira said. And so I insisted on all of us being only editors. Then we have Moinuddin Chisti by Babli Parveen, Guru Nanak by Navkirat Sodhi, Lal Dead, which has just come out by Shonalika Kaul. Later this year, 2 more books will come out, Kabir and Vivekananda, which I am doing. We have more names in the series: Hazrat Nizamuddin, Aurobindo, Ramana Maharshi, Ramanuja, Buddha, Shirdi Sai Baba, Ramakrishna, Saint or Mother Teresa, Karekal Ammayar. As you'll see, we are not going in any chronological order, because then, we'll have to be discussing whether so-and-so was before or after. So it's just at random. When we decide to take up a subject, we have been doing it. Why did we do this? This is called Life Lessons because India has produced some of the world's greatest thinkers, leaders, sages, philosophers, spiritual thinkers. And no religion has had a monopoly on them. They range from Mahavira and the Buddha, who lived over 2,500 years ago, to medieval saints like Chisti, Avayar, Guru Nanak, and to more recent philosophers and icons such as Swami Vivekananda and Shirdi Sai Baba. They have inspired devotees and followers with their erudition and wisdom, and the spiritual and philosophical heritage that they left behind is India's gift to all Indians and to the world. Through the Life Lesson series, we hope to examine the teachings of some of these great spiritual leaders and also bring it in very simple language. I mean, for example, take Adi Shankara. He has written 200 pages of the Viveka Chudamani, and unless you are really interested to read 250 pages is not easy. And that too, it's full of thee, thine, thou, which gets me very confused. So the idea here is to just cull out a few aphorisms which may not belong to any one book. So I've covered a whole range of books to take out subjects like, say, what does he say about the Brahman, about meditation, about so many, a spiritual life and the way it's spiritual practices and so on. So the idea is that each book should be a handy companion to help the reader along different pathways. Also, the idea is these books should transcend religion. Okay, they should not be restricted to religion, even though the philosophers we are talking about belong to one or another religious order. The aphorisms which we have taken out, the life lessons, as it were, is something that anyone from any religion can follow. So a Muslim can follow Adi Shankara and a Hindu can follow Chisti. So that is the way that we have done these books. Happiness and sorrow are unavoidable. The world is a place of trials and tribulations. How can one overcome suffering? Can hardship make a person stronger? What is happiness? Does it come from vast riches and great achievements, or is it satisfaction of the soul? Is worldly success more important, or is it fulfillment that one should seek? These questions have preoccupied the minds of great philosophers through the ages. The answers are found in several tomes in libraries. This series has just taken from the essential teachings of each one of these great philosophers and just culled out what is something that can guide anybody along their way. And it is to be found in India's spiritual heritage in a simple and accessible way. It is hoped that what you will find here will prompt the reader to delve deeper into the life and work of these great sages. So if you like what you read of Adi Shankara in my small little book, please go to the original and read what he had to say, which is so much greater. As the general editor of the series, as I said, I chose to call myself editor. It was not very popular with all the other editors, but I finally convinced them that we cannot say Adi Shankara Life Lessons by Nandita. It's not correct. We have only edited and produced what they have written. I think this is a good enough introduction to the series. Thank you very much.
We now move to the highlight of the evening, the launch of the books from Dr. Nandita Krishna's Life Lesson series. May I invite you, Dr. Nandita, on stage, please. May I invite Mr. Gopal Srinivasan, Chairman of Chennai International Center, to receive the first copy, please.
I suppose I should give you both.
Yeah, if you can all stand together for the photo. May I invite Justice Mrs. Prabhadevi to receive the additional copy, please.
Okay, so first I give you this so I can have my hands free, and then I open that.
Give me this and put it down.
Launch of books. You Are the Supreme Light, Adi Shankara, Live and Let Live, Mahavira. Both from Dr. Nandita Krishna's Life Lesson series. A big round of applause, please. What a lovely moment.
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor, Dr. Nandita, Gopal Srinivasan, Vanita. Thank you for inviting me to receive the additional copy and say a few words. I've read them both, and they are excellent. Um, a moment of, not of epiphany, but something that has often occurred to me. These two persons lived 2000 years ago, or whatever, and they must have come from a society which must have been at least 50% as clear and lucid as these two. And why are we here today like this? How can a country fall so low that we cannot match this clarity and lucidity today? That was what I felt. Where did it go? Where did that society go? And where did those people go? But it's nice that this series, Life Lessons, has been brought out so that maybe we can awaken to those thoughts and resonate with them, think about it, and maybe become thinkers. Both of them talk of equality and dignity. And that I found was very, very important. And those are the constitutional values that we have to reinforce again and again. And Shankara was a prolific writer, but he need not have written anything else but the Manisha Panchakam, and it was enough. About 4 or 5 of the works from which Nandita has chosen, I went to the commonly used translations, and this is so clear and pithy and simple, and one hopes, as Nandita hoped, people would go to the original. And thank you, Nandita, for saying here that the couple who are called outcasts in Varanasi, she asks Shankara, "O great sage, tell me, when you say go away, who are you addressing?" Yativara durya kurtum kim? He asks. And normally what people say is, then suddenly transformation, voila, outcast becomes Shiva and his wife becomes Parvati. No. Nandita puts it correctly. He deemed that the outcast was Shiva himself. Only then Shankara becomes great. If that outcast becomes Shiva, then he's like any of us. But Shankara saw that within that person there lived the divine, like the divine lives in any of us. As Mahavira says, the soul of an elephant and the soul of an ant are the same. I loved it. And he chooses so many upamanams from nature. He looks to the nature and then he speaks about what he wants to talk. And in Manisha Panchakam, the man asks, the water in the golden vessel and in the mud vessel are the same. What is it that you are trying to distinguish? Shankara wrote this so long ago. We still have not learnt the lesson. And that is something that we have to think of. We worship Adi Shankara, we say he is the Jagat Guru, but why aren't we learning that? Because the Guru dispels darkness. the darkness should have been dispelled. And Mahavira, I loved the last sermon, and I will just read it if time permits, Vanita. Yes, because it's the Uttaradhyayana Sutra. It's what he said to us last before he passed on, and there is an urgency about it. He tells us there is no time to lose. I'll just read this. Just as the dry leaves of a tree wither away, so too does human life come to an end. Therefore, do not be careless even for a short while. As dewdrops last but for a while on the tips of kusha grass, so too the life of man. Therefore, do not be careless even for a little while. It is indeed very difficult to acquire birth as a human. One acquires it after a very long time, for the karmas that bind the soul are very powerful. Therefore, do not be careless even for a moment. Just as the lotus remains unaffected by autumn water, so too should you give up all the attachments. Therefore, do not be careless even for a breath. When you have crossed the mighty ocean, why linger near the shore? Hurry across. Do not be careless even for a moment. Your body has become feeble, your hair has become grey, and all your strength is depleted. Therefore, do not be careless even for a short while. Whether in a village or in a city, steadily proceed on the path of peace with restraint and enlightenment. Do not be careless even for a second. Let us all not be careless. Thank you, Nandita. Thank you very much for the treasure that you've given us all.
Thank you for a wonderful speech, Mrs. Prabha Sridevan. May I now invite Dr. Shashi Tharoor to address the audience, please.
Thank you very much, and it's delightful to see you all here this evening. Some old friends and some new ones, and some friends I hope we'll make this evening. Nandita is a very dear friend. She really is a sort of elder sister to me, and when she asked me to come and launch her books, I was willing to do it, even if it meant sacrificing the Indian-Sri Lankan match, of which I have been unable, despite many attempts, to keep up with the score. So at some point, if anybody has a phone that can actually connect to the score, let me know when I finish. But meanwhile, let me get back to the more serious subjects before us. This wonderful, wonderful pair of books, which actually is part of a much larger series that Nandita has edited with Aleph. India has produced some of the world's greatest religious leaders, sages, saints, philosophers, and spiritual thinkers. I think Justice Sridevi said that. Perhaps we lack the equivalent today. I'm not sure she's being entirely fair. We have a profusion, perhaps not all of the same quality, but there is a great deal that we can be proud of in the distant past. And there were monks, there were nuns and renunciates, there were nationalists and reformers, and no religion had any monopoly on them, which is why, as Nandita explained, she has brought together this series describing the life and work of so many different thinkers, so many different people in religious traditions that vary enormously, both in terms of their subject matter and in terms of the time spans they occupied. Now, we have before us two of these books, which I think are the first two in the series, or the first two, and there are more coming shortly. And it makes a very handy pair of books to talk about in front of you today, because they address precisely the life lessons, the name that Nandita has given her series, because if we all accept that happiness and sorrow are both a feature of human life, and that all sorts of trials and tribulations come our way that we do need to deal with, and that often prompts questions, sometimes questions that human beings can't reasonably answer, and so people address them to the Creator as to whether we have to suffer, why we suffer when others don't suffer, why and how we have to overcome the suffering that's imposed upon us, and what role hardship and and happiness and so on play in our lives, what they consist of. And these are questions that have occupied the minds of very many great thinkers, including the two whom we are preoccupied with this evening. And they have found their own answers, and the very fact that there are so many thinkers demonstrates that there are very many answers to these questions. And so the life lessons that we have to face and talk about and think about are lessons which, very frankly, are lessons that perhaps we can choose from, because not necessarily would one thinker's way of looking at things appeal to us more than another's. But this pair of books actually complement each other rather well. And that's what I'm hoping to say a few words to you about today, because they and the other thinkers in Nandita's series are people who have obviously written a lot, or their teachings have been collated and compiled by a number of followers over the centuries. And so there's an awful lot of material that none of us in our present modern busy lives will have the time to digest. So this kind of very, very small, manageable, in a sense, pre-digested, edited work by Nandita gives us all an opportunity to look at these, the essence of the teachings of these great thinkers in ways that give us a flavor, and perhaps would inspire some of us with some of these thinkers to go on to read more deeply into their work, but otherwise will give us at least a sufficient understanding of what they said and preached in their own times. And what's very striking, as Justice Sridevi pointed out, and as I will illustrate in the course of my talk with a couple of excerpts also, is that Nandita has rendered the translations in very simple, accessible, and modern language. None of the these and thous that you normally find littering translations from spiritual texts. This is very much written for people like us today who can understand, as you'll see from the short excerpts that you've already heard and a couple more that I'm going to share with you. Now, if you were to look at each in turn, Mahavira comes first chronologically, even though there's some dispute about the dates, but there's no dispute about the fact that he was a few centuries before Adi Shankara. He was, I think the general agreement is that he was 6th century BC, reformer and philosopher. His life is dated in the most accepted version. There are many contentious arguments, but roughly 527 BC to 468. He was the 24th and last Tirthankara of the Jains. And he sort of really established Jainism as the faith that we now know today. The 23 Tirthankaras before, many of whom go back to the mythological ages, left no record of their teachings. So though Mahavira is not the founder of the Jain faith, as he's often inaccurately described, he is really the first person in recorded history, or in the times that we are familiar with or can study and read about and claim some connection to, that really laid a platform for our understanding of Jainism. And he was born into the royal family of the Ikshvaku dynasty in Kundagrama near Patna in present-day Bihar. And as a young prince, rather like the story of the Buddha, he renounced his family and all material possessions. But unlike the Buddha, who was inspired by some specific experiences and led a particular kind of life before attaining nirvana, Mahavira Jain practiced severe austerities after becoming an ascetic at the age of 30, performed intense meditation, spiritual austerities for 12 years, and at the age of 43 attained Kevalayana, or what was called omniscience. And having acquired that omniscience, he then continued traveling and preaching for another 30 years. When he traveled on foot, he preached, he gained followers around the country, and during the 30 years, he laid behind a series of teachings and lessons, which really constitute, in many ways, the Jain agamas. I mean, the core lessons of his teachings are really what we understand as constituting Jainism today. He was a great believer in the equality of all. He ordained men and women no gender distinctions for him. He ordained all people from all castes, all classes, all backgrounds, didn't believe in caste at all. He taught his followers how to overthrow the fetters of karma and liberate the soul from the cycle of birth and rebirth. And he stressed very strongly, because his was a fairly ascetic preaching and his own life spoke to it, the observance of 5 vows: ahimsa, or non-violence, and I'll come back to that because that turned out to be one of the most lasting influences on Hinduism as well. Satya, truth. Asteya, or non-stealing, it seems self-evident, but is one of his 5. Brahmacharya, or chastity. And aparigraha, or non-attachment. And these 5 lessons were core to his teachings and to the principles of Jainism. He said basically these 5 are essential before you can really achieve the spiritual liberation that your soul is seeking. Much more strict in many ways than Hinduism. We can come to that later. But at the same time, he also taught his followers how to live a life of truthfulness, compassion, humility, and non-attachment. And as we know from what we can compare separately with Buddhist teachings, the Buddha was born at a roughly comparable time. I mean, again, one can't be entirely sure. Some people claim some point of the 6th century BC as well. But when exactly was a little before, a little after, roughly the same time. And the Jains will tell you that Buddha came later and attained nirvana later. The Buddhists will tell you otherwise. But broadly speaking, they were, in a historical sense, contemporaries. And of course, in some ways, the focus on the soul that distinguishes Mahavira is something that marks him quite distinctly from the Buddha, who much more was concerned with our present day life. And the Upanishadic dictum, ahimsa paramo dharma, non-violence is the greatest truth, saw in many ways its peak, its apogee in the teachings of Mahavira. And also, as Nandita points out in her own introduction, his teachings on the relationship between all living beings and the 5 elements of earth, fire, water, and vegetation form the basis in many ways of environmental science today. And as you know, Nandita is also an environmentalist, apart from being a writer about spiritual issues, theological issues, and a Sanskritist. And as an environmentalist, I think she sees a lot of Mahavira's influence on the respect for nature and the respect for the environment that environmentalists practice today. So if you look at all of this, it's quite striking. And of course, his famous principle of Anekantavada, which has been cited by Mahatma Gandhi, more recently by Deen Dayal Upadhyaya and others, is an important principle. And I think we should come back to that, but basically talking about many-sided reality. And I'm going to come back to that, but I thought I should share with you a couple of very short extracts from his own teachings as Nandita has rendered them in her simple choice of excerpts and words. In conjunction with his lesson on ahimsa and non-violence, he had a lot of wisdom about compassion. He believed that every creature deserves to be treated with compassion and love. And one day, as Mahavira sat in meditation under a mango tree, 2 children began throwing stones at it to bring the fruit down. A stone hit the tree and a mango fell down. When another stone hit Mahavira instead, tears appeared in his eyes. The contrite children apologized. "Sorry, it was a mistake. We didn't want to hurt you." Mahavira replied, "I'm not hurt, but when you hit the mango tree with a stone, it gave you a mango. When you hit me, I had nothing to give you. The thought brought tears to my eyes." What a wonderful story, isn't it? And he goes on, of course, the lessons go on to say that anger begets more anger. Forgiveness and love lead to more forgiveness and love. These are things that deeply touched and inspired Mahatma Gandhi as well. And his notion of dharma, which embraced compassion, embraced humility, is very, very important. Now, of course, where he becomes rather severe for most of us modern human beings to follow is in his insistence that to lead the ideal life we have to conquer the self. I mean, no middle path for him, as the Buddha would have it. And so he talked about achieving happiness by controlling the things that we believe, perhaps wrongly, give us happiness. In modern life, the quest for material goods, a better home, in my case, a glass of water, please. I guess a bottle would do. Better, a bigger car, a better home, whatever. A foreign trip, a cricket match. These are the things we think give us happiness. Mahavira says controlling the desires for those things would give you happiness. And of course, he wants us to practice meditation and penance. And he says, start practicing control of the self with penance, begin with fasting. Human beings are unhappy due to their own faults. They can be happy only by correcting their faults themselves. Silence and control of the self constitute non-violence. Just as a tortoise withdraws into its own shell, a wise man should withdraw himself from evil by spiritual exertion. Just as a horse can be controlled by a bridle, sensual pleasures and passions can be overcome by knowledge, meditation, and penance. As a manic elephant is controlled and held captive by chains, the unstable mind is controlled and held captive by the chains of knowledge. Fight with yourself. Why fight with external foes? He who conquers himself will obtain happiness. By being honest, a man achieves sincerity of the mind, body, and speech. The five senses, the four passions, anger, pride, deceit, and greed, and the unconquered self are the 10 mighty enemies. When the self is conquered, everything is conquered. It goes on, but I thought I'd give you a flavor of what it's all about. And I'm going to read the very last extract which Nandita has in her volume before concluding my description of Mahavira. It's titled Right Worldview. Do not believe that the universe and non-universe do not exist. They do. Do not believe that souls and non-souls do not exist. They do. Do not believe that dharma and adharma do not exist. They do. Do not believe that bondage and liberation do not coexist. They do. Do not believe that the effect of karmas and their annihilation do not exist. They do. Do not believe that there is no attachment and aversion. They do exist. Do not believe that the fourfold existence of births does not exist. It does. Do not believe that there is neither liberation nor non-liberation. They do exist. Do not believe there is no abode of liberated souls. It does exist. And that's what he wants us to strive for. Now, Jagadguru Adi Shankaracharya, of course, very different individual, very different in many ways, and yet there is a connection, and I'm going to come back to that in a little while, but he is roughly 788 to 820 in the Christian era. So we're talking a good 1500 years after Mahavira. He was born in Kaladi in Kerala, and after traveling the length and breadth of India 3 times in his spiritual journeys, he died in Kedarnath in North India, so long way from Kaladi, at the age of 32. His travels took him, of course, from the southernmost tip of the country to Kashmir in the north, to Gujarat in the west, and to Odisha in the east, debating spiritual scholars everywhere, preaching his beliefs, establishing pithas and mathas, which took his teaching forward. And he is credited, as you all know, with establishing the Advaita Vedanta school of Hindu philosophy, anchored in the oldest Upanishads, and with making it the most influential and undoubtedly of the multiple schools of philosophy and theology that characterize Hinduism. It's the one that most, I think, helps us understand the essence of Hindu philosophy today. It was seized upon by such remarkable modern interpreters of the faith and its lessons as Swami Vivekananda and Mahatma Gandhi. And in his short life, Adi Shankara is not only credited with reviving Hinduism, which had become quite moribund by his time, but also with establishing the organizational structure for its survival and regeneration through the 4 mutts that he established in Sringeri, Dwarka, Puri, and Joshi Mutt. And probably, I mean, who knows, I still think he had a hand in Kanchi as well, right? And there are some in Assam who claim that he came there, though as far as we know, he never got beyond Orissa. But anything is possible. The man obviously walked very fast. Now, by the time of Shankara's birth, it's important to realize that Hinduism had been paralyzed by its own inflexible practices of orthodoxy and ritualism and formality, caste system, all of that, and was increasingly in retreat from the reform movements challenging it. So we've talked about Mahavira. There was also, of course, Buddhism, which notably gained in popularity because of the adoption of it by some prominent emperors, Ashoka being the most famous. The followers of Mahavira and Gautama Buddha, as I said, Buddha perhaps about 30 years after Mahavira, they branched out into what were clearly new religions, distinct from the Mimamsa Brahmanism, which was what Hinduism was at that point, and sort of mainstream Hindus saw them as distinctly different. But both new faiths flourished. So between about that 6th century BC and about the 8th century AD is what we used to say in my school days. I think now we say CE, the Christian era. So between, in those 1400 years, Buddhism and Jainism were significant players and really contended for space in many ways with Hinduism. And Hinduism itself was descending into esoteric disputes over Sankhya dualism, Charvaka materialism. There were various quarrels. Debates were happening, which is a good thing, but they weren't being resolved in any meaningful way except creating more factions, which I know is reminiscent to some modern political parties, but I won't go there. And then in the late 8th century, this youthful South Indian sage rose to heal and divide and rejuvenate this, heal this divided religion and rejuvenate it, which is what he did. Now, his Advaita Vedanta was a philosophically robust response to that era of confusion, integrating diverse thoughts and Hindu practices into a philosophy based on the Vedic dictum that there is one truth but many expositions of it. Now, Shankara emphasized the importance of pramanas or propositions. He argued and debated his way into prominence from a very young age. He began his sort of march through the country from the age of 8, it is said, as Adi Shankara, in what he spoke about Hinduism, chose to focus very specifically on just a handful of texts. He chose to focus specifically on the Bhagavad Gita, the Brahma Sutras, and just 10 of the 108 Upanishads, as in his view constituting the essence of the Hindu Dharma. These were for him the essential works. Already by then, thousands of works, all of which, of course, contended with each other, all of which were hailed by different schools, all of which had equal spiritual standing. But by focusing on these, he elevated them in many ways at the top of the canon. He illuminated them through his bhashyas or commentaries. Reasoning was for him essential to clarify the truth. So very much a practitioner of jnana. Shankara was a famous debater in his time, challenging and being challenged by those of different philosophical persuasions, but triumphing always through the power of his reasoning and the force of his arguments. His bhashyas were all written in prose, not verse, with lucidity and sharpness, employing the Upanishadic question and answer format that the West calls Socratic, but which we also knew in his time. He also authored one of you will have to correct my pronunciation, the Viveka Chudamani, is it? Chudamani. 581 verses spelling out the qualifications required in a student of Vedanta to be able to discriminate between the real and the unreal, to be able to maintain a spirit of detachment from this world, and to have the capacity to control sensory perceptions, and to feel an intense desire to attain self-realization and moksha. Does that sound familiar from what we've just heard of Mahavira? Not entirely accidental. Now, in this Adi Shankara reviews the entire range of Hindu philosophical thought and argument from the Upanishads to the Bhagavad Gita, and he doesn't see God as external to the universe. The world is in God and the two are indivisible. He stressed the idea that moksha, the realization of the ultimate purpose of each individual, whether you call it salvation or liberation, is achievable in the course of our present life, and his adherents seek their spiritual fulfillment in the acquisition of this profound spiritual knowledge and in immersing themselves in the indissoluble union of the true self, the true Atman or soul, with the highest metaphysical reality, the Brahman. Now, he argued this Upanishadic insistence on the unity of being, a divinity that's available to everyone because it's inherent in all of us. The Atma resides in everyone. It doesn't matter what your caste is, your gender is, or indeed whether you're an ant or an elephant, that lovely point that Mahavira made. The idea that all souls ultimately merge into the same Brahman, for instance, implies the equality of all souls. If all souls are going to end up there, then they're all equal, in which case, what sense does caste make? So he argued against caste discrimination on that principle. So does the Vedantic concept of the welfare of all human beings, irrespective of social or economic distinctions. And there's a famous story which Nandita also recounts in her introduction about how he, when walking in Varanasi, he is said to have encountered what formerly known as outcasts or untouchables or whatever. Those days were called chandalas. And he encounters this chandala coming and he's walking with his followers, this great sage, and the followers brusquely order the outcasts away from the road, saying, make way for the great sage. And this man stands his ground. He refuses to make way. And he looks at Adi Shankara and says, why should I move for you? Do you want my body, which is made up of physical attributes and sustained by food, to move? Or should consciousness move away from consciousness? Is not my Atman the same as the Atman within you? And Adi Shankara was so impressed, it is said, by this distillation of the essence of his teachings by this Chandala that he prostrated himself before the Chandala and said, you are my Guru. And that's a great story about him, but that's also something which goes to the essence of this notion that ultimately, of course, equality transcends social distinctions. Adi Shankara declared that any human being, merely by virtue of their personhood, could attain the supreme consciousness through a study of the scriptures, the Puranas and epics, meditation, fasting, and worship. He never mentioned caste, and that's our gender. For that fact, as far as gender was concerned, there was a lot of misogyny around in Hindu behavior. We all know the laws of Manu and so on. But in his very famous theological debate with his famous critic Madana Mishra, Adi Shankara appointed as a judge, and Nandi, you don't say that in introduction. He is the one who was asked to appoint the judge as the challenger. And he appointed as a judge between Madana Mishra and himself, the latter's learned wife, Sarasavani or Ubhaya Bharati. It is said, in fact, that he won the debate and Madana Mishra then quit his... That's that. That is in your book. He renounced his faith in dualism, became an Advaitist and became the foremost disciple, the second disciple of Adi Shankara. But what is interesting is, of course, that when he had surrendered, the wife, Ubhaya Bharati, challenged him to continue the debate with her. She said, after all, if I'm supposed to be half of him, he has lost, the other half is still standing. And she challenged him, it is said, and this is where Nandita says it's apocryphal, almost certainly is, challenged him to debate the Kama Shastra. Can you talk about sex? Obviously the celibate brahmacharya could not. So, now this is where the story definitely gets apocryphal, because it is said that Adi Shankara then transported himself through his spiritual powers, his mystical powers, into the body of a recently deceased king, sported with his royal consorts, and returned to his sage's body to win the disputation with Ubhaya Bharati. And so that story, again, is more about what a brilliant debater Adi Shankara was than perhaps believable entirely in our who knows, anything is possible. Now, it's interesting, of course, that Adi Shankara is credited with some tremendous clashes with the Buddhists. And in many ways, he took some useful ideas from them. I think there's no question that the notion of monasteries and mathas come from the Buddhist faith. I think there is absolutely no indication of Hindus having had monasteries before the Buddhists introduced that concept. And he took it cheerfully, and now, of course, we have mutts everywhere and pithas everywhere. He insisted, of course, on both Jnana Marga and Karma Marga. We're talking about this at the other event this morning, that both knowledge and action were important, and that again was something that distinguished him from the Buddhists. And this is where I want to bring us back to Mahavira, because I think what's interesting with both, but no, before I do that, let me share with you a couple of, I already have shared, no, haven't I? No, I didn't share this with you. There's so much to Adi Shankar, but I'll just read a short bit. At the sacred city of Varanasi, Adi Shankara was going to the temple after his bath. On the way, he saw an outcast couple in his path, and as was the custom in those days, asked them to move away. To his utter amazement, the outcast replied, "O great sage, tell me when you say go away, taking me to be an outcast, is your body addressing another body or is one?" Oh, that's the same story. I beg your pardon. That's not the bit I was going to read. It's the next bit. The Manisha Panchakam, which Justice Sridevi has already mentioned. Am I getting the name wrong? Sridevan. I'm so sorry. You're a lady. No, you're a lady, so I thought, it must be Justice Sridevi, but clearly you were saddled with your father's name, is it? So it must be, because you can't be a Sridevan, you can only be a Sridevi. Oh, there you are. So as Justice Prabha, Sridevi called it, Sridevan called it. The Manisha Panchakam is what she said was his finest work. So let me share Nandita's translation with you. Doesn't the sun shine both on the sacred Ganga and on the cesspools and the dirty lanes? Is there any difference whether the reflection of the sky is seen in a container made of gold or of clay? The universe is assumed to consist of diverse and different things. He who firmly believes in this unity in diversity, he is my teacher, irrespective of whether he is a Brahmin or an outcast. He is a great master, be he a Brahmin or an outcast, who dwelling on the pure and infinite Supreme Being, thinks of himself as a part of that very being. The differences in our physical bodies are the products of our previous deeds, good and bad, pertaining to our past, present, and future lives. The one who reduces the sins to ashes in the flaming fire of knowledge is the best informed. The Supreme Being is within all animals, people, and the gods themselves. It is by the reflection of this being that the mind, body, and senses are sentient. But the Supreme Being within us is concealed by the mind, senses, and body, just as the sun is hidden by the clouds. The person who, with perfect understanding and wisdom, always meditates on the Supreme Being alone, he is my teacher. He whose mind is united with the Supreme Being and is at great peace is not merely a knower of Brahman, but is Brahman itself. Such a person, whoever he may be, is fit to be worshipped by the gods. O Lord, in the form of this body, I am your servant. In the form of life, I am a part of you. In the form of soul, you are within me, and in every other being or animal that I behold. It's beautiful, and I must say, if I had had your translation, I would have quoted it in my little section on Adi Shankara in Why I'm a Hindu. And I'll end the Adi Shankara bit before I conclude with which you didn't mention, Justice, and that's the Eka Shloki. The Eka Shloki is one single shloka which successfully summarizes the essence of Advaita Vedanta in just one verse. In a dialogue between a teacher and a student, the student asks a question about self-realization, and the rest goes as a dialogue. Teacher, how do you see? Student, I see with the help of sunlight. How do you see in the night? I see by the light of a lamp. How do you see the light? How do you see even before you open your eyes? I see with my mind, with my intellect. What helps you see that intellect? It is I. Teacher, then you are that supreme light. Student, I realize that I am. So this is how he taught, and this whole Socratic method that I mentioned. This is a terrific way of bringing that self-realization. One of the things I want to end with, and as we look at these books, and some of us may say, especially the younger people here, well, how is this relevant to my lives, and why do I care, and so on. I think in the very big debate that's going on today about our own national identity, about the spirit and soul of our country, it's very striking that these two books actually speak of two people who have come up with ideas that, to my mind, argue very much for one answer to this. I mentioned earlier Mahavira's principle of Anekantavada, many-sided reality. It's something that inspired Mahatma Gandhi. It's actually, in his philosophy, a doctrine about the nature of reality and human existence, which has since, I think, facilitated in the 20th century and should today for us in the 21st facilitate the argument for universal religious acceptance or tolerance. Because if you accept that reality has many sides, you are predisposing yourself to an acceptance of pluralism and of a benign attitude to other religions and other religious or ethical doctrines and positions. For example, where Buddha taught a middle way, rejecting the extremes of it is or it is not, what Mahavira would have said probably is perhaps it is not. He was willing to see both possibilities. And when you come to Adi Shankara, I talked about how he abjured the distinctions of his time, caste, class, gender. And in many ways his doctrines served a later thinker like Swami Vivekananda, who argued for an expansive liberal understanding of Hindu philosophy, rather than the narrow-minded identitarian bigotry that is being perpetrated today by votaries of the movement called Hindutva. Now, while many of us are sitting around as mute witnesses to the reduction of the soaring majesty of great thinkers, philosophers over centuries, as understood and explained to us by Adi Shankara and Vivekananda, to its lowest common denominator. It seems to me these great teachers, though Nandita's ambition is only to teach us lessons for our own lives, actually also teach us a lesson that there is so much in common amongst these thinkers that we need to respect them all. Swami Vivekananda, and those of you who listened to my talk this morning already know this, memorably said in his famous speech to the World Council of Religions in Chicago in 1893, he said, "I'm proud to stand before you and speak of my religion, which has taught the world not just tolerance, but acceptance." And as I read that as a child, as a teenager, it stayed with me all my life. And the more I thought about it, the more I was impressed by the profundity of that idea. Like most of us, I went to school and learned that tolerance is a virtue, tolerance is a good thing. A tolerant king was a good guy because he allowed other people of other faiths and beliefs to flourish and live in his kingdom. But when you really think about it, tolerance is at bottom a very patronizing idea. Because it says basically, I have the truth, you are in error, and I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong. I'm granting you the right to be wrong. That's really what tolerance is all about. Whereas acceptance, which is what Vivekananda was talking about as the essence of Hinduism, is quite different. It says, I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth. I will respect your truth, please respect my truth. And to my mind, that's a very fundamental life lesson for all of us to learn. That some people, out of their bigotry, out of their narrow-mindedness, out of their majoritarian triumphalism, have managed to forget. And in denying this essence of Hinduism, while claiming to be acting in the name of a narrowly interpreted version of Hindu identity, they are in many ways claiming to be self-appointed protectors and promoters of a faith, while in fact violating its most principal core tenet, which is indeed, as all these Hindu teachers have taught us, a principle of acceptance. So we are enjoined to say with pride that we are Hindu, but I'm very happy to be proud of being Hindu, but I'm not proud of what they're proud of. I'm proud of these things. I'm proud of these lessons. I'm proud of these principles. And to my mind, traditions of inclusion, of acceptance, of respect for diversity. In fact, it's interesting that in one of Nandita's translations, she uses the phrase unity in diversity in translating Adi Shankara. I mean, that is ultimately a fundamental credo of the Indian Republic, the Indian state. The other side speaks of diversity through unity. They believe that the unity is fundamental, and some diversity will be tolerated beneath it as subsets of that unity. That's wrong, because you have unity only when you respect diversity, as we understood, I think our founding fathers understood, in writing the Constitution that they gave us in 1950. Because their method gives us assimilation rather than hatred, gives us the possibility of dialogue and debate, not violence and division. And therefore, I think it's extremely relevant for today's times, for the India in which we live, and the future that I hope all of us will have a share in building. Congratulations to Nandita for this wonderful series, for these excellent, excellent little books. I'm looking forward to the rest. And thank you all for giving me such a patient hearing. And now, does anybody know the score?
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. That was an absolutely riveting speech. Thank you. If I may please request you to come on stage for a brief conversation with Dr. Nandita Krishna.
What am I going to say? He said it all. He said it so beautifully.
Come. I'll ask you a couple of questions, including starting off with the question, what do you agree? Do you agree with everything I've said, or should we start having a little quarrel? No, about my understanding of these two sages, because if your understanding differs, it'd be interesting. I mean, do you think that my summary was too left out too much, or are these summaries? Is the mic working? Can you hear me at the back? Yeah. So if there's something you would like to say to complement either my summary of Mahavira or my summary of Adi Shankara?
You know, it's amazing that the more you read of what philosophers have written, the more commonality there is.
Yeah.
You know, it's not just Adi Shankara and Mahavira. No, it's not just these two, because subsequently I've been now working with Vivekananda, and it's very interesting. I'm starting Vivekananda with that Chicago speech on acceptance.
In the end, there were 5
toleration.
Chicago speeches, not
yes,
just
there were many.
because they invited him for a 5-minute address. In fact, I think they gave him 3 minutes. I think 5 minutes, maybe. But he did so well and got such a rousing ovation that they had to call him back. And the same thing happened. He ended up making 5 speeches. But anyway, sorry about the interruption.
No,
but this is the first one. Yeah.
In fact, that's the way I begin the book on Vivekananda. But they all talk about it. And you know, when we say unity and diversity, in fact, it's interesting that Vivekananda, for example, finds no difference between Advaita, Vishishtadvaita and Dvaita, which are 3 different schools. I mean, those of us who live in Chennai, who live in the south, we are very conscious of the different schools. You can't hear.
Just hold it.
I think I'll just hold it.
Yeah, okay.
Can you hear it now?
Much better. Much better.
So, by the time it comes to Vivekananda, he finds all the 3 schools have so much in common. So I think philosophers do not see differences, they see commonality. And that is what they are trying to do. So I think the more we read a philosophy, and I think this is the difference between just religious leaders and philosophers. Because a religious leader comes to you with a sect behind him. And he's just proposing and promulgating what he and his sect believe in. But when you go to a philosopher, he crosses that. That is an ocean which he crosses. And then he sees that there is nothing different. And that is what you find in Adi Shankara, Mahavira. You'll find in a lot more of these philosophers as you go on.
That's a fair point. And indeed, they're going back to the first principles, the first questions that we're all concerned with. And they're asking precisely from scratch what others have asked. And very often they come up in more or less the same place. Which is why in many ways and for many people, Jainism is no longer seen as a completely distinct faith. There are some Jains who insist it is, and of course the government has recognized them as a minority religion and so on. But in practice, for example, one of the foremost advocates of Hindutva is Mr. Amit Shah, who's a Jain. So when you think about it, there are many Jains who consider themselves de facto Hindu, and many Hindus who consider the Jains as a sect within the larger faith. And what's interesting about Nandita's observation there is that these commonalities usually converge in principles of harmonious coexistence. Because if most Hindus who've read any segment of Hindu philosophy have found one common idea, it is this essential notion that human life is all about the Atman within us seeking ultimately to merge into the ultimate consciousness that the Brahman is. And that it may take one lifetime, it may take multiple lifetimes. We seem to have absorbed that idea. Very few would accept Mahavira's injunction to live such a sort of, shall we say, perfect life of self-denial that we end up, in the end, achieving that in this, at the end of this very life. And we had recognized that these philosophers were highly evolved beings who in many ways can only teach us about perfection, which gives us something to aspire to, but which not all of us can eventually get to. In fact, I thought that the notion in Hinduism that there are at least 4 possible paths that you can choose to endeavor to do good, as it were, in 4 ways. One is, of course, Jnana Yoga, which Adi Shankara talked about a lot, knowledge. The path of knowledge, of reading, of understanding, and often enhancing understanding through debate and perfection. That is Jnana Yoga, and that is extremely, Jnana Yoga, which is absolutely indispensable. But there is also Bhakti Yoga, which was what most people practice, going to temples, praying, devotion, the path of devotion. There is also, of course, Karma Yoga. Mahatma Gandhi was a great Karma Yogi, and Vivekananda founded the Ramakrishna Mission so that service and sacrifice through service would be a way of achieving that self-realization spiritually for his monks. And finally, there is also what Vivekananda, Raja Yoga, which is the method of meditation, of focusing inward, where some look for God in the heavens, people of other faiths perhaps, but the Hindu practicing Raja Yoga is looking for God within himself. So all of these methods and ways are available, and many of us, few of us will be able to achieve any of them. Few will be able to achieve all 4, as perhaps a Vivekananda did, or achieve it at a level of attainment that, say, Adi Shankara did, because obviously that's not possible, which is why their life lessons are so relevant to all of us. Tell us a little bit about the job of selecting the bits. I mean, you're talking about a fairly significant corpus of work when it comes to Adi Shankara, somewhat less when it comes to Mahavira. Was it a huge task? Did you consult other scholars and experts?
Mahavira was a lot easier because
there was less to choose from.
Yeah, and not only that, I don't know Prakrit at all, and he wrote in Ardha Magadi Prakrit, which I don't know at all. So I never aspired to read the original. And there was Sri Dulichan Jain, I don't know if he's come here today. He's written a lot of books. He helped me a lot. And I just edited a lot of the aphorisms, and I put it under different heads, instead of the traditional, this book, like in the case of Adi Shankara, it would be Viveka Chudamani and Saundarya Lahari and so on. The chapters are different because the topics are taken from that. But for Adi Shankara, it was difficult because there's such a corpus of work. And to read those would take a lifetime. I first went to the translations, which I did not understand at all.
They're very archaic, no?
Yeah, archaic English, thee, thy, thine, It's a long time since I read Shakespeare. So I was out of my depth. So I said, this won't do. So I went to the Sanskrit. I did take a little help from the Sanskrit and the translations, kept 2-3 translations, and then I worked on it. But it was much easier to work from the original than to work from translations. But choosing is very difficult because I think my book would have come out this thick, but bringing it down to a small little booklet was difficult, but I did it. So that was difficult. Like Viveka Chudamani has so much. That one book, work alone is enough for a whole book. And to take bits of it, so I put a little bit under
that's much more about life lessons.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I put a little bit under Supreme Being, a little bit under meditation, a little bit under something else. That's what I did. So you'll find there are very few which are fully translated, like Manisha Panchakam, I thought was very important because nobody talks about it. Today, the Shankara Mathams all over India have become symbolic of orthodoxy and conservatism. Whereas Adi Shankara was the biggest rebel. I mean, he totally discarded the idea of caste, and not many people know about it. So I thought the entire thing should be kept. And similarly, 1 or 2 others, especially Shankara as a child, when he first meets his guru, what he says, then Ekashloki, which is also the title of the book, You Are the Supreme Light. So some I kept entirely, which are small, but others I had to take just a little bit from each and try and put it under different headings. I felt like I had gone back to the early 70s when I was a PhD student, because that time, you put down different facts on a little card, and then at the end of it, you put the cards together. So that's the way I had to work them all out.
Right. I mean, I'd love it if I know you've chosen to do this through individuals who are identifiable in whose corpus of work you're distilling, but if you could do something similar with some of the Upanishads, even though the author may be unknown, because there's such wonderful stories there too, and some similar lessons. Isn't it from the Chandogya Upanishad that you have that tremendous story of the boy who goes to his father, and there's this entire exchange where you have the essence in many ways of this, where he talks about saying he can't understand this whole principle of Svedeshwara, exactly. And the whole separation of soul and consciousness. And so his father tells him to go and taste salt and taste water, and then to mix the salt and the water. So he comes back, and the father says, now, can you tell them apart? And the boy says, no, you remember the whole story? And then the father essentially says, okay, now you separate them. And the boy says, it can't be done. The salt is dissolved into the water. And the father says, well, that is how the soul dissolves into the larger consciousness. This kind of thing, the methods of instruction in philosophy were fascinating, and you can see them in many of the Upanishads and in many of the ancient texts. And these are things that go back a couple of thousand years. So you're not talking about anything modern or postmodern or whatever, but there are ways in which instruction, ideas, and as I think Justice Prabhadevi Sridevan pointed out at the beginning of her remarks, we seem to have lost that extraordinary capacity to reflect on the important things. We are all caught up in the mad rush, the hurly-burly of contemporary material ephemera. And it's fascinating that in those days, their preoccupations were otherworldly. And I'm sure a lot of modern-day materialists would say they were doing that because they didn't have enough to enjoy on this earth, and therefore they had to think about those things. They were dealing with primordial questions. We realize that the world offers much more. But even there, they were anticipated by the Charvakas. Yeah. I mean, I'd love to see a little book of life lessons from the
Charvakas who totally denied everything.
Exactly.
I mean, they were absolute atheists, more than any atheist of today.
Exactly. So there's I don't think there is a thought that is being thought today that hasn't been thought a couple of thousand years ago by some forerunner of our spiritual civilization. And I'm so glad that attempts being made to resurrect them.
You know, what I think is missing today, Shashi, is that storytelling. Yeah. You know, like you gave a little story about the boy and his father. We read it only from texts. How many modern writers make up the story? We are so hesitant to, write stories. I mean, I'm not a fiction writer. You are semi-fiction.
No, I published 3 fiction, come on.
Yeah, but your fiction comes from a lot of fact.
That's true. And I draw a clear distinction between fiction and fact, I hasten.
Yeah, but
my fact is not fiction, my fiction is not fact.
Yeah, but the fact has inspired the fiction. So, no, but what I mean is, would any of us today think of this little story? Why is it that thought process has gone? That, I think, is the big difference in what is happening today. Because even when you go to any religious discourse or anything, they're repeating the same Upanishadic story, Adi Shankara's story, everything. I don't see new stories coming out. And that, I think, is what is missing today. You know, if that thought process of creating new stories comes out, I think there'll be a complete change in mindset. And I think we have to, I hope some young people who are listening upstairs will think of stories to illustrate a lot of things.
Great. I'm going to open it up to the audience if you have any questions for either Nandita or myself. My God, lots of hands. Yeah. Oof, playing traffic policeman is going to be a tough job on this one. Okay, I think the first hand to go up was this gentleman right here. So, yeah. The blue shirt, if you'll give him a mic. And we'll come to you, sir, and that gentleman, 3 there, and there were 3 here, and then we'll see if we have any time because the organizers haven't allotted that much time for Q&A. Go ahead.
Okay. My name
So
is
keep it brief and make it a
Sure,
question.
sure, sure. I'm Vaidya Subramaniam from Shastra University. My question is more a wishful thinking for your consideration. You're author of Why I'm a Hindu, and in Dr. Nandita's own words, editor of Life Lesson series. I have a proposition, and I seek your worthy consideration. Can the author and the editor get together for lessons on Hindu living? Next book.
In a sense, you've done that already in the series, haven't you?
Yeah, we were supposed to, in fact, do Vivekananda together, but he was so busy with his elections and the publishers were in a hurry that Shashi got dropped and I stayed on. So it is possible. Maybe he should find time. Since I do a lot of writing, I have a lot of time. Shashi,
One
what
day.
are you going to do?
One day we can do. In fact, Nandita was one of the very few people I entrusted to look at the draft of my Why I'm a Hindu, and her comments are very useful and have gone into my redraft of the book. So I would, on subjects like this, I am not closer to anyone than her who can understand these issues and advise me. So we'll find some way of collaborating. Thank you. Back row, yeah, the gentleman there.
So, Namaskaram, I am Ramesh. Well, it is very nice to see Shashi Tharoor in saffron robes as of now. So, a good transformation.
Robes is an exaggeration. It's
saffron
just a
kurta.
kurta.
Yeah. So, even that is a good
Yeah, as you know,
decision.
it's one of the three colors of the Indian national flag and of the Indian National Congress flag.
Very true.
So, I am not prepared to surrender this color to any other claimant.
Acha, acha. So, in any case, it's a very nice shift that I am able to see in the last 2 months in you. In
Why?
terms of-
No shift at all. I've been
I
wearing
haven't
this
seen
throughout.
that.
I've worn this throughout. Believe me, there are photos of me in Kerala
Acha.
running around in a munda with this multiple times. But go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, well,
Don't read too much into it.
just yeah, I will. Shashi Saab, using your contacts with the global people with whom you have got decades of connection, can you have these kinds of books translated into very many other global languages by which Indian stuff goes all over and make it shine once again?
Thank you. It's an interesting thought. Again, individual publishers will make their own commercial decisions as to what they consider viable. I'm assuming, Nandita, that LF will be quite willing to offer it.
I'd like to just tell you, my other books, Sacred Plants of India, Sacred Animals of India, Hinduism and Nature, they've been translated into Hindi, into Marathi, and Marathi was done by Sakal, which is, what's his name, Sharad Pawar's paper. So there are Indian languages who are doing it. And, these are all, my books are all full of Indian and Hindu ideas. So they're going around India in different languages. I don't know about the rest of the world.
There should be a possibility, but it depends very much on individual
It depends on the publisher. These are all the publishers who have to get into contracts with others.
But I think it's entirely possible, for example, that a place like the Frankfurt Book Fair, a series about life lessons would appeal to lots of people and they might well be bidding for it. Yeah.
Dr. Tharoor, thank you for the distillation of all these wonderful ideas. My question is, right now, one of the things you spoke about is accommodation and acceptance. So I'm talking about the context of Mr. Talib's book, Skin in the Game, where he spoke about peanut allergy, where it started with a few kids having peanuts and peanuts are not being allowed in birthday parties, peanuts are not being allowed in schools and things such as these. And now more people are developing peanut allergies and peanuts have been phased out. So at what stage should we, draw the line on accommodation such that we won't even be able to enjoy the lifestyle or the natural course that we otherwise would? Any ideas on that?
Yeah, my thinking on this is very clear. I don't know that particular book of Talib's, but what I will say is that the conventional assumption has always been that the person who doesn't eat something has every right to politely say, I'm sorry, I can't eat that because I'm allergic to it, or I can't eat this because I'm vegetarian, or I can't eat that because I don't like it. But I think human beings have the right to do that. But none of us has the right to deny other people a pleasure that they should be subjected to. This is something Mahatma Gandhi directly addressed in a far more sensitive issue, which is the question of the banning of beef. When people called for the banning of beef, now not only Mahatma Gandhi, was against beef. He was against all animal killing and eating of meat. But he said very simply, I cannot impose my preference and my values on those who happen not to share my values, whether for religious reasons or conviction or anything else. They have the right to eat what they want to eat, and I have the right not to do so because I think it's wrong. I do not have the right to impose my sense of what is wrong on them. And that is, I'm a vegetarian very much. These are the thinkers who influenced me greatly. And I have, not consumed any flesh or whatever since I was, flesh or meat, or even of fish or fowl, since I was about 4 years old, even though I was initially as a baby given everything. And my conviction is such that I have brought up 2 children to eat everything, one of whom, without any persuasion from me, turned vegetarian, and the other one who's completely carnivore. I love them both equally, and I believe each has the right to be who they are. Each of us has to decide for ourselves. But on the question of allergies, of course, for example, if somebody is allergic, it's often quite serious. They could break out in a rash or a sweat, or even worse, a toxic shock can happen. So you warn them, listen, this contains peanuts, or this thing has been cooked in a pan in which something containing peanuts has been cooked. So you decide on your own what risk you want to take. That much I think the person has a right to know. Never feed somebody who's allergic to something they're allergic to without warning them. And that, as long as you follow that principle, then both sides ought to be happy. I'm not in favor of one person's peanut allergy affecting everyone else. And this is why when the famous controversy arose a few years ago, when the Iranians refused a banquet, a state banquet, by the president of France because wine would be served at the table, I sided with the French. Even though I'm notoriously anti-colonial and this and that, I said the Iranians have every right to say they won't drink the wine and please pour water in our glass or juice. But they have no right to tell the French not to drink their wine. I mean, my position is absolutely clear, whether it's drink or food or anything else. Now there were some hands on this side. Yes, this lady and this gentleman. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. You told that acceptance is one of the very core tenets of Hinduism.
Yeah.
But this very notion is being forgotten by certain groups who misconstrued the great religion to manufacture their own narratives. In current times, we are seeing religious hate crimes on the rise, slogans being raised in the temple of democracy, etc. All this is being done in a nation which has welcomed all with open arms since time immemorial by saying Aditi Deva Bhava. I just wanted to ask you, are Hinduism and Hindutva on the same page or in the stark contrast to each other?
Now, I believe that Hindutva is actually anti-Hindu. I genuinely, I've written an entire book making the argument at some length, so I would commend it to you if you haven't read it. It's a very detailed discussion of my understanding of Hinduism, not based on any superior theological knowledge on my part, but distilling the teachings, the ideas of the great books, the great Mahatmas of Hinduism, the great teachers and thinkers. And I argue that the distortion of these thoughts by the Hindutva thinkers such as they are, and worse still by their followers who today frankly don't think and don't read, but nonetheless have persuaded themselves that theirs is the only way to protect the faith and protect religion and protect Hindu identity. I mean, they've literally taken this rather magnificent faith, as we've just heard today from Adi Shankara alone, and reduced it to the sort of team identity of a British football hooligan. You know, my team is better than your team and I want to hit you on the head if you support the other team. I mean, that kind of nonsense is not Hinduism. It's a betrayal of what Hinduism is all about. And to my mind, more and more Hindus who have understood what Hindu philosophy teaches us should speak out openly against those who are distorting our faith allegedly in our name. They have no right to speak in my name or yours.
Let's look at any book, Upanishad or any philosopher, whoever you want, whoever you choose. Does anybody say lynch the other guy? I mean, if anybody does so, nobody does.
Good evening to both of you. Actually, I was struck by the example you quoted from Mahavira's teaching about taking the metaphor of a tortoise who withdraws into his shell for withdrawal from early. It resonates. It bore close resemblance to the verse in second chapter of Gita, where Krishna gives the same example of how a realized soul will be. Yada kurma undaniva. So is there an influence of Mahavira and Buddha's teaching on Bhagavad Gita, or is it vice versa?
Look, all these were ideas that were floating around at that time. We don't know who influenced who, what happened where. Of course, they would have influenced each other. The date is where it is controversial. I would
Not
say
that controversial.
Bhagavad Gita is older.
I would not say that.
You would not. So, these are two, you've got two different points of view. Any case, this idea is neither from Hinduism or Jainism. All these ideas come from the Upanishads. That's what I would say. Like even ahimsa paramo dharma, that comes from the Upanishads. That is what is older. And you'll be surprised that it's mentioned even in the Rig Veda. Rig Veda talks of veganism, not just ahimsa. It says that if a man takes away the milk of a cow, which is meant for its calf, he says, Lord, cut off his head. I mean, of course, it's like lynching, but...
Also, he didn't know much about cows because they produce far more milk than the calf can consume.
That's another matter. But you know,
And
to
they would
that
be in pain if you
extent,
didn't milk them.
That's another matter. So these ideas, I mean, when I'm talking about the Rig Veda, which is much, much older than everything. So these were ideas, you don't know who took it from where. So,
Yeah,
probably-
there I agree with Nandita. It's just that, as much as we know about dates, if Mahavira was at some point 6th century and the only dispute is different dates within the 6th century for his birth, and then correspondingly he died, 70 years, 72 years later. If you look at that and we accept that the Bhagavad Gita was interpolated into the Mahabharata at some point, but the Mahabharata itself was composed roughly between 400 BC and 400 AD, roughly, then clearly that anything in the Mahabharata ought to be later than anything in the Jain teachings, because Jain had long since passed on, but the Mahabharata consumed. But
Bhagavad
there are
Gita is an
disputes
older
about it.
Sanskrit than the Mahabharata. Mahabharata is a later form of Sanskrit than the Bhagavad Gita.
Which
So
is why it
it's
was an interpolation.
very possibly. I'm not denying the interpolation, but the language of the Bhagavad Gita is definitely much older. That's why I'm going by the language, not just a
There you are.
random date.
But as she said, Mahavira wrote in Prakrit, which he hasn't read, so I don't know which
Prakrit
how
is
old.
later than Sanskrit.
Yeah, Prakrit is a common
Classical
man's.
Sanskrit.
Yeah, there was a hand behind. Yes, sir.
Very thought-provoking conversation. I'd like to understand how do you think about the concept of acceptance when there is a threat to your existence? Now, this question is very blunt and direct. If my temple is being broken, would you preach acceptance at that point of time? Or
No.
would you preach to stand up
Yep.
and fight for what you think is dharma? And if
Because
you
the
differ,
person
how
breaking your
does-
temple is not accepting you.
let me just
Acceptance is
complete
both ways.
Sure, let me just complete my point. So that's one question. And the second, this is in the context of Hindu temples having been under government control with the Congress government being in power for the longest time in this country. So I would like to understand, I would totally like to understand, when you gave the example of acceptance, you spoke about you respect me, I respect you. Now that is mutual respect, which Rajiv Malhotra also speaks about. So I'd like to understand, how does acceptance work when I'm in threat? And how do you reconcile that with Sri Krishna goading Arjuna to stand up for Dharma? Thank you.
No, so my answer, first of all, is that acceptance is a two-way street. As I said when I explained, as I understood it, Swami Vivekananda's concept of acceptance is, I respect your truth, you respect mine. Now, if you don't respect mine, you obviously attack my home or my temple or my place of worship, you are not accepting my truth. And if that's the case, then of course I'm not obliged to respect yours. In any case, I've got to stand up for what I believe in and what I cherish, right? I mean, that's human nature. You don't allow someone to attack that which is precious to you, in whatever capacity you have to resist it. But the problem is when there is a predisposition to be aggressive, even when there is no evidence of attack. And it's even problematic when attacks that took place centuries ago are being retaliated to today against people who are not only not complicit in those attacks, but have no intention of mounting any today. So what's happening with a lot of this kind of, because the Muslims broke my temple 700 years ago or 500 years ago, I will knock yours today, is that it creates new injuries and new wrongs that need to be healed and new retaliations from the other side. I think there's got to be a time limit on revenge. But, this is not an argument that can be easily resolved. I know what you're referring to. But this perception of threat is very often grossly exaggerated and is very often ahistorical. The problem also is that to be very often an essentially North Indian view of history is sought to be imposed on all of us. In Kerala, for example, we have a totally different experience of Islam from the North. It never came by the sword. It came through peaceful travelers and missionaries who had been coming from that part of the world for centuries before Muhammad the Prophet was born. And when they brought this message along, it was embraced and welcomed. And a Kerala king traveled to the Saudi Arabian Peninsula to meet this new prophet. So intrigued was he by this message of equality and brotherhood. And he met the prophet and he perished. He died in this Hajj that he performed. But what is fascinating is that the evidence of his trip remains. If you just fly to Muscat in Oman, you'll see on the coastline Kerala coconut palm trees growing on the Arabian Peninsula to which they're not native. And that's because these coconuts were taken by Cheruman Perumal, this Kerala king who went to meet the prophet. And they were planted there before he never came back. Now, this kind of exchange is very different from Muhammad bin Qasim coming with the sword or Ghori and Ghazni attacking Somnath and so on. It's a different history. It's the same country and it's the same religion and the same forms of worship that are seen as being threatened, but the threats are in the historical past. And at some point you've got to say, today we live in today's conditions by today's rules. Those who don't respect those rules and transgress them on either side will have to be dealt with firmly by the state. The state should not be soft about that. But my own view on that is that as far as your concern is expressed, the moment you express it as a theoretical question, for today, I support your argument. The moment you say, but his great-grandfather's great-grandfather attacked my house, and now I'm going to go and attack him, I say you're being crazy.
The same thing applies for caste system as well, right? You can't apply the same criteria of post-colonialism to caste vis-a-vis.
We probably won't resolve this in one evening,
There's a
but
question
think
here.
about what I said. Yes, young lady.
At one point, a factual sort of correction. You said you spoke of Shankara and gender equality, but Shankara is supposed to have said also that any woman who reads the Vedas will have hot oil poured in her ears.
No.
That's
And
it.
I have read this. I've read this in a book on. No, I can't remember. But he's supposed to have said that no woman should.
You've read a lot of
I
Adi
haven't read
Shankara,
it.
and I've read a
Has
fair
he said it, Dr. Justice Prabha? I have never come across this.
May I show it to you, Nandita, a little
Yeah,
later?
please
Where?
show it to me. Because
Please, ma'am, it doesn't fit in with what we
which
know.
work? did
This
you-
was some time ago. I read it, and I was a bit
It
scandalized.
may be a commentary in which he is
Yeah.
quoting someone
No,
who said
no,
it in
no.
one of the ancient texts and rejecting it. It's not something he would say.
No, Mr. Tharoor. He said is supposed to have said that this.
No,
that
I've
he
never
would
come-
work.
And you know,
Because I've
he
read
did
a
not
lot of Adi
particularly
Shankara.
emphasize the Vedas at all, which is
Yeah.
another reason why I doubt this quote. Because he actually focused on very specific and limited texts. He took the Gita, he took the Shastras, the Brahma Shastras,
Upanishads.
and he took 10 of the Upanishads. The Vedas are different.
He
Vedas
not
are...
Veda meaning Upanishads or whatever, but they said any woman
No,
who
you can't
reads.
say whatever, ma'am.
No, I'm sorry. What I'm saying is that if you read Sanskrit, I think it was Sanskrit, it was Vedas or something, any woman who does it, no, I'm a
So
student
please
of
find the
history.
reference, because
Look,
it could be Manu.
Could be Manu.
No, not Manu at all. We know Manu. I mean, we know what he said. We are talking of Adi Shankara. Anyway,
I have not come across it.
Nandita, you and I are good friends. I'll give you the book later.
Please.
Okay?
I have not, because I read a lot of books too. Read only Shankara's own writings. I didn't want to go to commentaries about it because then you go haywire. I just read what Shankara wrote. I have not come across this.
And even for a punishment for reading, the year seems an odd destination.
Yes, you can.
I think that lady will have to ask the last question and then we are ready to wind up. Please.
All right, so there's all this talk about, Hinduism having to be protected and all of that. Wouldn't you still, I'm asking you because you've recently written a book on Hinduism, but I wouldn't say that you ascribe to Hindutva particularly from what I've read about you and read what you've written.
No, I oppose Hindutva.
Yeah, I get that and I'm very appreciative of that. Would you say that even today, Hinduism is what one needs protection from, so to say, and that Hinduism is the threat?
No.
No.
Because if Hinduism properly understood doesn't threaten anybody or anything. It really is As I said, a religion of acceptance, it's a religion that embraces, it's a religion of inclusion, it's a religion of dialogue and debate, not one of either hatred or imposition or whatever. And social practices that are objectionable, such as caste discrimination, one is free to reject and still be a Hindu. And I think those who choose to follow caste practices have only themselves to blame. There's plenty of scriptural justification for ignoring and rejecting caste, and there's plenty of textual material available if you want to justify it. In many, many ways, I think one of the things on which you and I would agree is that most of the teachers do not differentiate by human beings on the basis of
they
their
don't.
externalities. External things, social conventions and customs, even gender, are really not a preoccupation of Hinduism. The soul is within all of us, and also within ants and elephants. And
Even gender isn't.
Yeah, I mean
you
gender
have
is not
people
the
like
same.
Gargi who took part in public debates.
So Hindutva does threaten people who don't subscribe to its tenets. Hinduism threatens not at all. Hindutva, sadly, is a threat to that genuine Hinduism. I think I'm going to leave it there. And Nandita, thank you so much for the great job you've done.
That brings us to the end of a lovely evening. Thanks.
Thank you.
Heartfelt thanks to our special guests who are here today, and to you all, our lovely audience who make the institution Chennai International Center what it is today. On behalf of the trustees and board of directors, let me thank one and all. Thank you.